Hello and welcome to the Western Spirit. Today we're going to speak with a very special guest, but first I want to just give a short overview of why I'm speaking to our guest and why it's so important. So in the past few months, I think since October 7, but maybe even before, but specifically after October 7, we've seen giant protests all over the West, especially on college campuses, but not only. Like I've said before on our program, my family lives in Brooklyn, New York, and we've had very large protests. My aunt lives near NYU, near in the Village, and we've seen protests there in Union Square Park and other places all over the West. In London, obviously, every weekend, hundreds of thousands of people come out. And it seems to me that a lot of us, including me, don't really have a grasp 100% on where the language and the ideas behind all these protests are coming from. We've talked a lot about the woke ideology, aggressive, extreme progressivism, and also, and we'll ask our guest in a few minutes about where, also we'll get to it about where these ideas came from originally and how they've developed and evolved over time. And so I want to welcome Izabella Tabarovsky. She's a scholar of left anti-Semitism and a contributing writer for Tablet magazine. And I think, so obviously just the title of you, it shows how you're relevant to the conversation here. So first of all, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So let's start, first of all, with your thesis about what I read about and what you talk about. You basically study Soviet era, I'll say, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I'll ask two things. Number one, just to start off, if you can give us a historical overview of when Soviet propaganda started against anti-Zionism, because when Israel was founded, the Soviets voted for Israel in the UN. And they were on the fence in terms of just what they thought would be the best strategy with Israel. They started off supporting it, then they realized, I guess, that Israel was going to be more pro-West, and they wanted the Arab states to support it. And then at some point, and I heard you say this, in 1967, the propaganda after Six-Day War went outside of Soviet Union to all the world in different languages and cultures to try to influence the world to be anti-Zionist. So could you give us a sort of an overview before we start about today? What happened then?
Sure. So, when I'm asked to give intros to lectures, I'm often given like 7 to 15 minutes. And I always joke that basically I'm asked to cover a century of anti-Semitism in 7 minutes or less. And I think here I have even less than that. But I'll just start by saying that the Soviet Union was always, the Bolsheviks, the communists were always against Zionists. And there are multiple reasons for that, and we can come back to it if you like. But the shape of this anti-Zionism, the particular form that it took, changed over time. So you see anti-Zionism already appear in like 1913 in an early Stalin paper. And then it's an important part of the revolutionary thinking. And then, but at that point, it kind of grounds itself in Marxism. We can argue whether it's correct in guess or not, but it's not yet sort of conspiracist in the way that it becomes under Stalin. And so when you get to Stalin, it becomes conspiracist, and it becomes conspiracist around 49 and 1950. So this is a couple of years after the vote at the UN takes place. So there was a very brief moment when you could say the USSR made an exception, but it's not that it's suddenly turned Zionist. There were other reasons, and one of them was a geopolitical consideration, the belief and the hope that Israel would be a part of the Soviet camp and would certainly stand against the British Empire in this critical neighborhood. Now, Stalin understood very quickly that was not what Israel had in mind, that's not what Ben-Gurion had in mind, that it was going to stand with or orient Israel toward America. And that's when you have all the different anti-Semitic campaigns, which had a very strong anti-Zionist component to them. Both the Rutgers Cosmopolitan campaign and the Doctor's Plot, these are the things that are known the best. And then also in Czechoslovakia, the Slavsky trial, when loyal communists were hanged and accused of being Zionists, they all had an anti-Zionist component to them. So then, and that sort of that thing cheated after Stalin's death on low boil, I would say. And then 1967 happens, and at that
Isabella,
point,
could I stop you 1 second with a question? If during all this time, before we get to 67, the Soviets are still in touch with parties inside of Israel. I know this is not exactly a conversation, but the communist parties in Israel, which were in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, were parties that had direct contact with the Soviets in Russia.
yes,
Mayor Vilner and other people in this, the Arab parties,
yes,
had connections, which were basically a lot of times, I think Ben Gurion even said, we have my borders without Maki and without the right wing. He refused to make a government with them because he understood that they had direct connections with the Soviets. So on the one
yes.
hand, they're doing anti-Zionist propaganda. On the other hand, they're trying to influence inside Israel. So also we could maybe learn about what's happening now in a sense where there is propaganda against the West, but we're trying to influence the internal politics of the West. So
Yes.
maybe that was always the inside-outside game that the Soviets played.
Well, that's 100%. And Mir Vilner becomes a very important figure actually after 67 in Soviet propaganda, because what the Soviets wanted to say and desperately wanting to show once their out and out propaganda, international propaganda gets going in 67, they also really want to show that they're not being anti-Semitic. This is actually
Exactly.
where this whole line appears. We're anti-Zionist, we're not anti-Semitic. This is what we're hearing today, but it goes back to the USSR over 50 years ago. And so they would always say, and this is interesting, again, we can come back to it, but they in contrast, this is one important distinction between what we see now and what we saw then, is that the USSR never actually said that they wanted to wipe Israel off the map. Now, they supplied the regimes and trained and financed and the regimes that wanted to wipe Israel off the map. But externally, on the diplomatic level, on the public relations level, they never said that. And so they would put forward Vilner all the time. And they would say, you see, we are friends with Israelis. There are good people among Israelis too. We just want to de-Zionize this regime. The Israeli people are suffering under the Zionist regime, and we are here to help them remove this oppression.
Yeah.
So yes, absolutely 100%. It was a very important party in the
So what
Soviet
happens after 67? Why does it change so much?
So 67 is the Six-Day War, and the Soviets, of course, had been for a number of years, had been developing relationships with the Arab world since the 1950s, and they trained and financed the Arab regimes, and they really did not anticipate at all that Israel could win in a potential war. And when Israel did win, it set off all kinds of it essentially created a panic in Moscow because they were trying to understand why it is that Israel won, and they came to the conclusion that Israel couldn't have won on its own because essentially it won against the USSR, you could say, right? Because it was fighting in a proxy war against the regimes that it trained and financed. And so they begin to connect the dots. And for your listeners, I'm using scarecrows with my
Yeah.
hands here to say that, look, so the Soviet political culture was always conspiracist. It's just a feature of totalitarian regimes. And 67, this is just, a decade and a half after Stalin's death. Stalin's regime was deeply paranoid and deeply conspiracist. And the KGB was a very conspiracist organization. So they begin to connect the dots in ways that conspiracy theorists do. So they look around and they say, wow, well, look at America. First of all, they're immediately saying that it's America, their main Cold War rival, that supported Israel in the Six-Day War. And they look at America and they say, wow, well, look at all the Jews there. They're everywhere. There's so many organizations, there's so many Jewish dominated groups, so many synagogues, and Jews are everywhere. They're in politics, they're in finances, they're in the media. So they essentially assume this a slogan which they may have picked up from their friendly Arab regimes and then just amplified that America is a Zionist colony. So they say all these Jews are pro-Israel, they're Zionists, and so this is where the source of the support comes from. So they're already zeroing in on a fundamentally anti-Semitic thesis, right? The Jews are hide everything of significance that's happening in the United States. But instead of talking about Jews, they're talking about Zionists. And a big part of that is that, the Soviet regime ideologically, actually from the very, very beginning, was built on the idea, the socialist regime, right? And so Lenin said that he was against anti-Semitism, and there was something in the constitution that prohibited racial hate and discrimination, and that included anti-Semitism. And so some of the anti-Semitic classics were officially prohibited, like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, even though they did circulate inside the country. But basically, as socialists, they feel that they can't go out and accuse Jews of all kinds of things. So they Zionists, they just make that substitution. And so a big propaganda campaign begins, and this propaganda is international. It's carried out in multiple languages, in dozens of languages. It's transmitted throughout the world. Its target is primarily, I would say, the global left in the developing world, because this is where the Soviets see an opportunity to create sort of a leftist ecosystem that can become an echo chamber in support of Soviet foreign policy goals.
But one question before we get maybe into some examples is, it seems to be when we talk about conspiracies against Jews and like classical anti-Semitism, they just changed the words here a little bit to anti-Zionism because that was more acceptable and more, it sounds better. It's not against Jews per se. It's even though most of world Jewry, more than now even at the time, were Zionists. But I guess my question is, in a lot of ways, it seems to me that these tropes that were used were very right-wing anti-Semitic tropes, meaning if you just change the words to anti-Semitism and not anti-Zionism, you had the exact same neo-Nazi tropes that you'll hear in white supremacist circles today. You just have to change the words from anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism. Is there a lot of like overlap do you see between the two ideologies? So like a lot of times you'll see the horseshoe. So you'll say the extreme left and the extreme right will meet somewhere on most issues when they make a full circle back. Do you see the same happening here in terms of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
100%. When you look at some of the tropes in my presentations, I have a slide where I show that there is actually a pretty exact correspondence with the main tropes, such as the Jews control politics and money, and Jews have a corrupting interest in the youth, and they would say the same about Zionists. And when you actually look at the people who created this propaganda, the so-called Zionologists, they were actually deeply conservative is not even the word. I mean, they were right-wing. They were people who had, like, far right-wing, right? People who had fascist views, some of them. Some of them admired Nazis. When the perestroika arrived and it became acceptable to express these views openly, some of them, in fact, joined the extremely xenophobic and anti-Semitic movements that arose kind of out of the ruins of the USSR and produced the Russian far right, the Russian extremist far right. So this is, I think it's sometimes hard for people to understand this point. But sometimes I talk about, well, how we all know that there was a dissident movement in the USSR, the liberal dissident movement, right? The pro-Western dissident movement. We know about that. But at the same time, and this happens after Stalin's death in the late 1950s, a different kind of dissident movement emerges. And this movement believes that instead of looking toward the West, Russia needs to be looking to its traditional history, to monarchy and to Russian Orthodox Church. And that movement caught with extreme anti-Semitic views. And that movement reads the anti-Semitic literature, the pogromist literature, the Holocaust of the Elders of Zion. And that movement had a lot of success penetrating the party circles and the Komsomol, the youth, part of the youth movement within the party, that they penetrated that as well. And so there was, even though the USSR in general was monolithic in the sense that it used the communist ideology overtly, but underneath you did have this kind of counter, I guess, sort of these two opposing viewpoints. And inside the Soviet leadership, at some point, as this campaign keeps going on, inside the Soviet leadership, there is actually, and also inside the Soviet academia, there are discussions about the fact that this is actually, that what we're producing now is really anti-Semitic. And some people begin to point out to, the correspondence with pogromist literature and Nazi literature. But the far right movement wins out, and it holds sway in this area through the end of the USSR. And the reason is, I think that it was just extremely politically expedient for them. This propaganda was extremely useful for them, particularly outside the country. And so they just couldn't give it up.
So just maybe we can zero in on exactly what was happening. So after 67, you explained the difference was basically that they start pushing this propaganda outside, trying to influence other countries, other societies with this anti-Zionist slash anti-Semitic propaganda. And so how much do we know, like how much money they put into this? How many languages were they translating this, anti-Zionist, but really anti-Semitic propaganda? Where were they focusing? You said developing countries. When did this come to the Western countries? When did academia start really getting into this kind of, talk that we're seeing now? And so give us a little bit of the overview of the logistics of it.
So first of all, let me say what it is that they were saying, because I think that that's really important. So,
Right.
the thing that we hear today about Israel as a fascist, imperialist, external colonial, racist, apartheid, genocidal, terrorist state, this is one the Soviet propaganda was putting out from the 1960s onward. Literally, all of those kind of ideas, those tropes, are there. And Zionism it presented Zionism as a deeply reactionary ideology. They've redefined Zionism. They have to get the full credit for redefining Zionism from the way Jews understood it and from the way we understand it today, right? They redefined it into this reactionary racist movement that is against national liberation movements, that's in bed with the intelligence service, that is the CIA and whatever, the British service, the intelligence services, and of course the Mossad was a big part of it. So this is what we're hearing then. The slogans that promote contemporary slogans like "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," and all of these English language chants that we're hearing today, that is a more recent invention, so that you don't see there. But the fundamental idea that we're seeing today, that Zionism needs to be eradicated and Israel essentially needs to be eradicated, and because Israel is like a Nazi state, they don't say it, but they begin to equate Israel with Nazi Germany, again, already in the 1960s. They talk about Israel's treatment of Palestinians, equating it with the way that the Nazis treated Jews. And so from this, the only conclusion that one comes to from this is that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. Again, the Soviets said that, well, it's fine, it can exist, it just needs to be designated. So these are the ideas. So it's hard to, and probably even impossible to evaluate the amount of money that was pumped into it, because these were state resources. They were never counted. They were not, nobody cared. This was positioned as the ideological priority. And so everything that needed to be put into it was put into it. So the Soviets had very strong, a very strong kind of propaganda apparatus extending to, I think it's like around 100 countries in the world. That was thanks to their Novosti press agency, which was really just not even just a propaganda agency, but it was fully penetrated and managed by the KGB. So you had this supposed news agency operating legally throughout the world, collecting news, but also suggesting various materials to friendly media, right? This is how you have like fake news placed somewhere in India, and then after a while it makes its way, into the US. This is what happened with the whole AIDS hoax, the idea that it was the America that created it. It created it on purpose. So that there was that. There were propaganda brochures that they published. They co-opted their academic institutions, created special departments in a few so-called, you could call them think tanks, that were supposed to essentially produce materials that would justify the propaganda. So they wanted scientific materials, scientific justification for the propaganda. So they called it scientific anti-Zionism, kind of like scientific communism, scientific atheism. They created this fake fields of scholarship, which of course were, they needed to tell the Protestants is a self-help, there's
Yeah.
zero value. But there was
Isabella,
one,
just one question.
yeah.
You wrote, if I'm not mistaken, that they actually had an office or a group of people that were working for the Soviets, that their job was to research and put out this anti-Zionist stuff, if I remember correctly, right?
Well, I think that you're probably thinking about the Zionologist circle. That's what I was referring to, like a group
Hmm.
of maybe a dozen and a half approximately people of this kind of far right mentality. They work directly for the Central Committee of the Communist Party, or some of them work directly for it in salary, but others worked for other institutions, but they were coordinated by a senior official in the Central Committee, in the International Department of the Central Committee. The International Department is this may be getting too far into the goods,
Yeah.
but it's significant because that department was the one that managed relations with all the left-wing parties and with the developing world, and allocating resources to various, to various entities abroad. So in this universe, so these were the people who produced the most important fundamental works that then everybody else could reproduce or improvise or riff off of, and produce articles based on that. So that was directly straight from there, from the top party leadership. The KGB was involved. The Foreign Affairs Ministry Ministry of Foreign Affairs was involved. So it was coordinated at the highest level.
You mean that there was people who were working for the government in the Soviet Union who their job was to put this specific, it wasn't like part of a thing. For them, it was that was their issue.
Exactly.
They were getting money, they were being paid to just put out into the world anti-Zionist propaganda. Nothing more,
Precisely.
nothing less.
Yes, precisely, exactly. And it was it was not entirely separate. It was viewed as part of the general kind of ideological warfare that the Soviets conducted. And so, which is why, it's intertwined with the idea that, that of the US being portrayed as kind of great evil in the world, right?
Yeah.
So whatever ideological campaigns the Soviets put out, this was also wrapped into it. And you see it, one interesting way to trace it is to look at the publications that were put out by Western communist parties, and not only Western, also in the developing world. The communist parties that we know were financed by the USSR, it's confirmed by scholars, and also by publications that we know that were not overtly communist, but were also financed by the Soviets. So you can look at that, and you can see how once the ideological wind changes, and at this kind of conspiracies anti-Zionism becomes a crucial part of what the Soviets are putting out into the world. All of these parties and all of these publications begin to reflect these ideas in their statements and when they're publishing. You can look at proceedings from conferences, left-wing, far kind of, get-togethers, irrational left-wing get-togethers that that we know were organized under Soviet auspices because they were organized through the Soviet funds, such as the World Peace Council. These organizations that again are known to have essentially represented or were maintained to reflect or echo back Soviet foreign policy interests. So all of them they just go, they assume the same positions in regards to Israel, with regards to Zionism. And I think it's important to understand because it helps us understand how these ideas penetrate and essentially become conventional wisdom. Because, lots of ideas are put out into the world every day. So why is it that these ideas became such a widely held belief on the far left, right up to his moment? This is like, it's a given, right? If you are part of the far left, essentially, you assume that Israel is evil and you understand in these terms, and Zionism as well. So if you look at that, you can really see how it starts to penetrate into the kind of broad masses that are
Right.
broadly assuming far left positions.
Can we also just in general say before we explain how today it's being we touched on it, but how it's being, run in these protests, the actual terminology and everything. But before that, you explained that this was part of the overall ideological war that the Soviets were playing here during the Cold War. So can we assume, and I think it's obvious, but I think it needs to be said, that Israel was considered, the idea of Israel, not just Israel as a country, the idea of Israel was considered by the Soviets and their supporters as a Western idea, meaning the ideals that Israeli society portrayed, not just that Israel was part of the bloc of the West, but its idea, the Zionist idea, the nationalism that it came, the nation state that it was objectively was considered something that needed to be fought because it was Western, because its values were Western, and that meant that it was a threat for Soviet ideology, not just Soviets. Israel was not obviously a military threat to the Soviet Union, but it was an ideological threat.
Yes. Well, that's exactly right. And, the Soviets spent a lot of time trying to explain away the argument that they perceived could be made or was being made. Why are you making such a big deal out of such a small country, such a tiny country, and it's surrounded by enemies? And they would say, well, it only looks like a small country. It's not actually, it's actually much bigger because it is part of this global imperialist bloc, and Israel is there to sort of to channel through which global imperialism channels its interests in the Middle East. And then, yes, absolutely, the condemnations of Israel were made in the same breath as condemnations of the United States.
Yes.
It's the Soviet secular version of Great Stalin and Small Satan.
Yeah, like Iran.
Yes, exactly. So, yes.
Let's now bring it down to where we are today. So we see all these protests in the past few days in all the universities in America. The language is very, very similar to what you're talking about. Like you said, you explain in your literature that you write in your studies that you could really trace the language and the ideology from those days of the Soviet Union till today among woke, progressive, I think you'd say the extreme left, like you explained. I guess my question is, when I'm looking at these protests, I see two big groups. Number one is the Muslim Arab students, who are also, we even see they're praying Islamic prayers in the campuses during these protests. They have they're all wearing the kafiyas. I mean, that's also the left-wing protests that are Muslim. But in general, and then you have the other side, which are the left-wing, very secular. And you have this convergence of two very weird and sometimes even it looks like, for the rational mind, contradictory positions, like Queers for Palestine. Everybody brings them up, but they are an actual organization. And when you think about it, do you think that also on the Muslim side of this, of the way the terminology that is used, obviously a lot of it is Islamic and religious, but is there anything behind it, before we get to the actual secular leftists, of these Muslim and Arab students, are there anything that they're saying that comes, do you think, from the Soviet propaganda?
Well, look, I want to be clear that I'm not an expert on Muslim anti-Semitism, but
Yes, obviously.
I do have to say that the Soviets. I think that in Soviet times, my suspicion, I think more, no, my assessment is that there was a two-way street between the Arab countries and the USSR in terms of the development of this propaganda. So we know, for example, like I already mentioned, this whole idea of America as a Zionist colony. We know that one of these Soviet Zionologists who worked under the Central Committee borrowed it from a brochure that was put out by an institute in Egypt that essentially engaged in anti-Zionist propaganda on Nasser's behalf. So, and this Zionologist had served in the Soviet embassy in Cairo in the 1950s. He spoke perfect Arabic. In fact, a number of the people who produced this anti-Zionist propaganda were Arabists by training, and they had deep connections in the Arab world. So it is very possible that some of the ideas that penetrate or that colored the Soviet propaganda comes from the Arab anti-Zionists. But, I think that what the Soviets did is they amplified it, because we know that Egyptian propaganda was very strong, but I really don't think there was anything in the world comparable to the amplification abilities of Soviet propaganda. And so I think that a lot of the things that the students are saying, the move, we understand that they're not outside, they're not even students, but that Islamist art of what we're hearing on campuses, they just think in the same slogans. And whether and again, what is their direct source? I don't know. I think we need to do more research on that, but it's certainly the language that the Soviets very much amplified and turned it into theirs in the 60s, 70s. I'll say one more thing is that Mahmoud Abbas, of course, defended his dissertation. Yes, in 82 in Moscow, right at the center at one of these think tanks that were created specifically in that department, that were created specifically to legitimize the propaganda. And what is his dissertation about? It's equating Zionists with Nazis. His dissertation advisor was one of the people who was part of this, not the most prominent member of the circles that crowd this propaganda, but operationally was important in it. So you see that he comes and he quotes Soviet propaganda in his thesis. I looked at it very closely. So then he goes back, and then a book was published in Arabic based on his thesis. So you can see how then Soviet propaganda, which they, by the way, also translated into Arabic. So 100% it was a two-way street. And there were other deep kind of collaborations with Palestinian groups. So that's what it is.
And also, Isabella, one thing that I do think is good to mention is that I remember reading that one of the big traits of Arab society especially in the more regressive regimes, was the fact that conspiracy theories were a main theme of the way they spoke to the people. And a lot of that stayed with a lot of these Islamists and these ideologies that hate Israel and the U.S., etc., blame for their plight on the West, etc. And the same thing was in the Soviet Union, like you said, because it was used as a tool to the masses, like you explained, to use the fact that maybe life isn't as good as it should be, to put it in mild terms, by blaming someone else. It's a conspiracy against us, the West, the Zionists, etc., etc. So that was something that I've read a lot, is the two that the Soviet Union and a lot of these Arab leaders had in common. And so that's one thing.
And another important element to note here, and the historian Jeffrey Herf has written extensively on it, is the role of Nazi propaganda in the Arab countries.
Yes.
And that's also important to understand. I mean, look, ultimately, again, and before that, of course, there were Christian missionaries who came and spread the protocols and the elders of Zion. So it's a continuous, it's a century worth of conspiracy mongering in the Arab societies. And again, when it comes to Jews, it doesn't matter what source it comes from or what specific form it takes. Is it Christian anti-Semitism? Is it Nazi anti-Semitism? Is it Soviet anti-Semitism? In the end, the tropes are the same. The fundamental perspective that Jews are both subhuman and super powerful, and they run the world, and they are the source of all your troubles. No, that remains, and that coalesces into a kind of coherent point of view.
Now I want to go to the actual, what we call the left wing of the protests. And one of the things that I want to ask you, maybe just as a point of reference, is that a lot of the academia during the 60s and even the 50s was very pro-Soviet. So a lot of the professors, the leading professors of these campuses, we think today it's extreme, but also then a lot of the intelligentsia of the West, in the US, and some of Europe, was very, very looked at the Soviet Union as sort of a model of, an economic system that was more fair. They looked at they basically looked at the Soviet Union in a lot of ways, maybe not and everything, but they did always look at it as a point of reference, a lot of these academics. And so we do have a progression from then until now in a lot of things on that scale. So maybe give us a little bit of overview of that.
So I just want to correct something that you just said a little bit, because I think that by the 60s and 70s, there is already a split in the Western left. So this is when the new left emerges. And a lot of times when I talk to people who were part of the new left, this is, what is the new left? The new left rejected the USSR. They rejected Stalinism. When all the revelations came out after his death, he definitely had much more support for the USSR, more unified support among the intelligentsia before the revelations of his crimes. And then you have the Hungarian uprising, which the Soviets crush in an absolutely just violent way. Tens of thousands of people are murdered. It creates a massive crisis on parts of the left, certainly also among communists. So a new left emerges, which claims to be disgusted with the USSR, and it sort of develops a new vision for how to create a better world and a better society. Portions of the left, however, remain oriented toward the Soviet Union. And you could ask, well, how influential was it? How important is it? The new left has its own intellectual, views and all that. But what I think what unites all of them is that they remain Marxist. They maintain Marxist vision. The new left thinks that it's moving in a different direction. But I think what's interesting about this, and this is something that I'm researching now, is that even the new left, even the people who say that they really hate and despise the USSR, such as Trotsky's, right? They are competing against the Soviet Union. But you look at what they put out and what kind of language they put out with regards to Israel, and it's the same language. And this is what I find so fascinating. It's like they reject everything about the USSR. They say that Stalin was a counter-revolutionary, and the USSR is not even socialist, and it's kind of state capitalism. They invent all these crazy kind of theories that never actually proved to be true or correct in any way. But this one thing remains the same. This virulent language about Zionism and Israel remains. Now, another part that I think is really interesting, and again, this is something I'm exploring now, is this third worldism of the new left. The fascination with the third world, the looking toward Cuba, Nicaragua, and Vietnam, and to their revolutionary leaders as inspiration. And what's interesting about it is that, of course, the USSR had deep influence in the third world. The KGB ran so much in that world and tried to manipulate that in that world. Then this is, if you travel in those circles, this is, again, my assumption, which I'm working on proving now, is that if you traveled in that, if you were part of the ecosystem, you simply assumed whatever kind of package of views it came with, and this kind of the virulent view of Zionism in Israel was a big part of that.
So these protests, do you think that they understand, a lot of them, that, or most of them, or some of them, that the ideas that they're spouting are ideas that come from where we're explaining now? Or do you think that it's almost a subliminal thing where it's something that just came over time? These groups are being indoctrinated year after year after year, class after class after class, and you don't really ask when you're being, by authority figures, these professors are telling you this, and all your reading material is this, and we spoke about with different professors from Harvard, from Yale, you have these full, campuses where all you'll teach about Israel, about Zionism, about the Middle East is about how bad America is and how bad Israel is, and colonialism and all that kind of stuff, settler colonialism. And so you're not really going to ask where it comes from. You take it as granted. That's the truth and that's it. Or what do you think?
Well, I think that it's the latter. It's precisely it. I think that this language became, and these views became a given in the 70s and 80s, that it just got passed on through generations on the left. there's no other way to explain the specificity of the correspondences between in the language. I wrote in one of my pieces, I think in Colette, that you could ask, well, could today's left simply reinvented this language on its own? And I
Right.
think you can believe it only if you can believe that somebody could just like sit down at their keyboard and accidentally reproduce Anna Karenina, or War and Peace without consulting the original. It just doesn't happen. I mean, we're not talking just the slogans. We're also talking about very specific stories that they tell, like the story that Zionists view themselves as a chosen people, and that's what justifies their settler colonialist aspirations, or the whole story about Zionists collaborating with the Nazis in the Holocaust. The way they tell the story of Kastner, Israel Kastner, the Hungarian Zionist who during the war tried to see Hungarian Jews, ended up being in close contact with Eichmann. Very complex story. But the way the Soviets told it is that, it was Kastner did it, he collaborated with Eichmann because he was a Zionist and was a position of the Zionist movement at the time to collaborate with the Nazis, because the more Jews they annihilated together, the more guilty the world would feel after the war, and the more likely there will be the possibility that Israel will be created. So the Zionists will hear their state. So very, very specific stories are repeated from generation to generation. I don't think that people today know. I don't think they care. I don't think they ask this question. I don't think that their professors know. Some of their professors work very hard to justify these ideas. I don't think anyone has made any convincing case that Israel is a colonialist state, that Israel is an apartheid state. No one has actually managed to make this case, but they work very hard to do it. So in a way, they're doing the job of the Soviet think tanks. So anyway,
Yeah.
I don't think that they know. If they knew, probably a lot of them would not care, because in their eyes, the USSR, that's another aspect of
They
misandry
like the USSR now.
Right. Exactly. They love it. We see hammer and sickles everywhere in the
Yeah.
Gaza encampments. There's a complete lack of historical consciousness, of historical knowledge. And I think if we get to solutions, I think one of the solutions is to start to completely revamp how we teach it, which is a
Yeah.
hard thing to do in the US, given how decentralized everything is.
And it's also hard because all the professors believe in this stuff. So you need to either you need to. I'm not exactly sure that there's any way to do it, and that's what's very depressing. But
Yes.
I wanted to ask you one more thing about this. We've been seeing in the past maybe 5-10 years this woke ideology. So maybe until like 10 years ago, we had left wingers, but the Democrat Party, for example, you could never even imagine that someone like Rashida Tlaib, AOC, Lan Omar would even be considered as members of Congress, let alone AOC was named the new face of the Democrat Party, I think by Time Magazine or one of them. And so I guess my question is that the worldview of the woke seems to me to be that when we put it down to something that's easy to explain, is any discrepancy on outcome means that there is someone being wronged. Any discrepancy, let's say, of outcome, of obviously economic outcome, but also military outcome, or if we see one country that has a lot and one country that has little, or one country that's stronger, the other country is weaker, the weak is always in the right and the strong is always in the wrong. So also with racial groups or anything like that, you'll never have a nuanced discussion on policy. It's always someone is wrong and someone is right, and the right is the weak and the wrong is the strong. And so is there something about like the way they look at the world now that corresponds with the way the Soviets looked at the world? So just to maybe boil it down, did the Soviets look at themselves as being the weak and therefore the right, or is this something totally new?
That is a really good question. I mean, the one almost read there is that, look, I think that the left in general, and certainly in the Bolsheviks and the communists, always looked at the world through the prism. I think it's Marxist, looking at the world through the prism of oppressor versus oppressed. So what they was the start always, the way they positioned themselves was as the defender of the oppressed. I don't think they even questioned, I don't think they publicly raised the question of whether they are powerful or not. No, they were these, country little kittens, basically, who are also, however, there to defend our press. Now, the one thing, and this is something that somebody just recently explained to me, because this difference is that if you approach the oppressor versus oppressed binary from a purely Marxist perspective, you actually have a way to change that binary. So the oppressed, so in classical Marxism, the oppressed are the workers, right? The workers of the world, if
Yeah.
they unite and they rise, then they no longer are oppressed, right? They can take over the positions of those who are oppressors. Now, of course, I don't know. The question is, do they then become the oppressors themselves? I don't think that they went there ideologically to talking about that. But the current binary was so excuse me was so bad about it.
Weird. Yeah.
Yes, is malignant almost, I would say, is that these assigned categories are immutable. So if you assign the oppressor versus oppressed status from qualities that you can change, like the race,
Like
right?
race.
Yes,
Yeah.
the color of your skin, then that creates, that creates really a frustration and a feeling that there is nothing you can do to change it. And I've seen some of the reporting on the kind of a mentality, but not mentality, but the kind of feeling that creates for people. It's a real kind of despair. It's a real nihilistic
Exactly.
ideology. So I would say that that's perhaps a big difference.
And also, if you're already talking about that, is that they see Israel, and I keep on seeing this, that Israel is white. It keeps on coming up that Israelis are white, the Palestinians are brown, and therefore the white, it's just like in the Western countries where, for example, the claim is that whites are more successful, therefore they're always racist against the blacks, which are always the ones that are black, Hispanics, whatever, if you're in the US. And I guess, first of all, it's very weird because in Israel, most of Israeli Jews are not white, are not Ashkenazim anymore. So just on a basic, like, factual matter, it's very weird. And I guess my next question is, going back to Soviets, was the Soviets so obsessed with race? Were they talking about race all the time in Soviet Union?
Well, I think their views on race were perhaps more consistent with the classical kind of leftist positions.
Yeah.
I don't think I mean, yeah, this view, I think, is something very new and an outgrowth of the more recent thinking. Now, the Soviets were obsessed with ethnicity. They were obsessed. They certainly talked about racial relations in the U.S. They very much tried to manipulate that to their own advantage. But this particular way of looking, this lens, I mean, this lens is essentially reestablishes racial hierarchies, right? It puts race back at the center, right, of our view. And I think
Well, we spoke about that. The left and the right are meeting somewhere, and the extreme left and the extreme right.
Precisely.
100%.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and what's interesting about this to you also is that, as you point out, although the categories seem to be immutable, the perception of who is actually, so whiteness is assigned a category of negativity such that you can then present it onto someone who is not even white. They call it white adjacent. So they don't like Asians, they don't like Jews because they're successful. So they're white adjacent. It doesn't matter what color of the skin they actually have. So it's a lot of mental acrobatics there.
Also, the difference, I think, between anti-Semitism and racism in the classical form is that racists saw the let's say the blacks and the Asians at the time, they saw them as being less than them. They saw the blacks as being less, three-fifths of a human in the South, for example, etc. But the anti-Semites look at the Jews and say, oh, they're too successful, therefore there must be some conspiracy that lets them, suck off the teat of our Western, you know, and so the Soviet Union in a way used the opposite. There wasn't the racism against Zion. It was a more, look at the Jews, they're being so successful in Israel. Look at the Jews, they're being so successful in the West. Therefore, there must be some sort of a conspiracy where they're, you know, using this immense power that they have, where they control everything. They're so strong. It's the opposite of the classical racism. I think that's the main point that needs to be made. The distinction between racism in its classical sense and anti-Semitism, which is more of a conspiracy theory.
Well, I think with anti-Semitism and the conspiracy theory, and with the anti-Zionist conspiracy theory, is, you know, it's both. Then, you know, they do look at a Jew as both subhuman and super powerful.
Yeah,
You know,
at the same time.
at the same time, exactly. Just like, you know, with anti-Semitism, you have these contradictions all the time. So for the left, the Jews were associated with capitalists, and at the same time, then under Stalin, they so they're both so they're capitalists for some, you know, but then there's a whole big group that views Jews as having been the Bolsheviks. So
Yeah,
Jews are both capitalists and the Bolsheviks, right? And then they're both ruthless cosmopolitans, what you have at Stalin's time, and they're extreme nationalists, Zionists. So you have
they're
this
everything bad.
everything bad, precisely, you know, and this kind of building on the idea that Zionists stand at the heart of all the ills that we face as humanity. You see it today. So there is this institute that was established relatively recently, I think last summer, essentially, as it came on everybody's radar in California, the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. So you look at their literature, and they're talking about Zionism as being involved. It's everywhere. It's in Central America. It's in India. It's in North Korea. I mean,
Who knew?
who knew? You know, and again, you go back to there's something about this the kind of evolution of the left where it has lost connection with reality, right? It's a
Yes.
complete abandonment of reality. They're in a fantasy world. Because when you read that and you again take a step back and you're like, wait, look at Israel. Look at the number of people that live in Israel. Look at the total number of Jews that live around the
Yeah.
world. It's ultimately, they may not come originally from the conspiracy perspective, but they come to it because this is the framework that they're there with.
Isabel, what maybe just to finish the topic, it seems to me that when I grew up in New York, we had protests on campus, obviously, against Israel. Every time, I remember in 2003, there was in middle of the second intifada, there was the whole thing with Ramallah. And I remember that the tanks were outside Yasser Arafat's office, and there was a whole there was big protests against Israel, for Israel. The same slogans pretty much, that we hear today. But I think the main difference is that it was much smaller in scale. And it was more of like a fringe thing. Even the left, the mainstream left supported Israel. There was no ifs and buts. At least in America, the mainstream institutions supported Israel. Okay, we're critical of the government, let's say, but we support Israel. That's the basic where we're coming from. Today, it seems that obviously it's grown in number. I think that there's no denying that. And I think a lot of the institutions themselves, as an institution, are taking very critical stances on Israel that you could only call as being anti-Zionist, because they're not taking this stance on other countries that are way more problematic in terms of human rights. Even if you do take what they're saying about Israel 100% true, it doesn't compare to what other countries in the world are doing as we speak. And so my question is, why do you think this has grown in the past few years? And number two, is there anything historically looking back that we can do to combat this? Is there anything we can do, or is we just, obviously we're talking about it, so maybe other people that are in these protests will listen to us and maybe understand where it's coming from and try to maybe think about it. But other than that, is there anything that as a society, as governments, there anything we can do, or is it too late?
So on why it's grown, I see that a lot of people are trying to understand it now. I don't yet I don't think we have a definitive answer yet. We've seen this ideology, critical theory derived ideologies, the DEI, for short, although in time it's called diversity, inclusion, and equity ideology, deceptive union,
Yeah.
being introduced more and more and more. And these ideologies position Jews, because they position Jews as white and they paint white as evil, they're inherently conducive to coming to the conclusions that that Jews and or Zionists in Israel stand at the heart of everything. You have certainly the spread of the BDS movement, the students for justice in Palestine, that we're seeing more and more. A suit that was just filed against them suggests that
They're on
they
every campus. It's unbelievable. I
exactly.
never seen any organization that's on every single, even the smallest colleges. They
Yes,
have a chapter there, and they're protesting, and they're bullying students and teachers. And
yes,
first of all, I think we have to number one. I just wrote an article for Globes, the newspaper that I work in, about the funding that we know about for these organizations. We don't know everything, but what we do know is that they're getting a lot of money from NGOs that on the more extreme left, like the
yes.
Open Society, the Rockefeller Brothers, and probably we don't know yet, but I assume Qatar and other countries are giving them
Right.
money, so they have very deep pockets.
Yes, well, exactly. And we need to do much more discovery on this. I hope that in the process of, as the suit proceeds, that much
Yeah,
more will have to come out so that we can see it. I think the general consensus is that these protests are neither spontaneous nor, yeah, they're not independent. They all speak in the same language. So there is a lot that we need to figure out, so there is kind of intellectual and there is practical politics. And
right.
so we need to look into all of it. How do we fight it? I'm often asked this question when I give talks. And a lot of times people will ask me, well, could Israel improve its Hasbara? Or give me 3 talking points that could improve our position. And I always, I feel so sorry that I have to disappoint people. I just don't think that this is so big. It's not a Hasbara issue. We can't improve this or change it through better PR. Because absolutely everything that we say, everything that Israel could potentially say, will be inverted, converted. It's just a very long and well kind of well-developed track in which people do this. And so, I mean, we Jews as a people have not been able to defeat the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? In over 100 years that they exist, we haven't been able to shake off the defamation of that little book. So this is really the scale of the problem that we're facing. We're this is what we're fighting here. So I think just to manage expectations, I don't think that we will be able to defeat it in that way. I think what needs to happen is we need to start with ourselves. I think that perhaps this is more for American Jewish audiences. We need to be strengthening the Jewish identity. We need to be educating young Jews on and in general the Jewish community on the danger of left-wing anti-Semitism. I think that now it's a little bit more clear for people, but I remember before October 7th, for years, we were in this conversation of which form of anti-Semitism was more dangerous, left or right. And constantly people will say, well, the far right is far more dangerous. They are, white supremacists, blah, blah. And because I come from the Soviet Union and one of the USSR, I know, and I always used to say, and I think I have every article, it is proven with historical record of how the language of anti-Zionism is weaponized against Jews and why it's so dangerous against Jews. And Einan Weish says all the time that every society where anti-Zionism became a dominant ideology, Jewish life ended. So we need to be now teaching. I think we have a window of opportunity to be teaching. The Jewish community needs to set itself the goal of learning about this, of learning why the USSR was also a very bad experience for humanity. They know very well about Nazi Germany, but they don't know about communism and the Soviet Union and what happened to Jews under those circumstances. There's a lot of education. There is a lot of identity building. We need to kind of stop this teaching of young Jews from the Jewish community to the other side. And I think this eating happens because, I mean, look, the propaganda works on everyone. It sways everyone. If you don't have inner resistance and
Conviction.
resilience, was that
Conviction. To know where
conviction?
you're coming from, what your ideas are, the facts, and know that you're
Yes,
right and know that you're
yes,
just.
exactly. If you don't have that, if you have nothing to show against the other side is very motivated and very passionate. If we don't have it, we're going to lose in that. So I think that this is
Yeah.
what we need to be working on.
And also, I'll just say, I know this is like a weird thing to say, but when we look at the protesters that they're being arrested now in Colombia and UCLA and everything, they just seem very, very not. They just seem obviously they're not well educated. It seems to me on the issue. They ask them, for example, what river, what sea, nobody knows, and all these types of videos. But also, they just seem not happy. They're very, very bitter. It seems to me. No one's smiling. No one ever. I know this is like they're very angry, and I think also we have to think about young people in the West in general about social isolation. We know that in the West, I've spoken about this a lot. Church attendance and synagogue and attendance has gone way down. People do not have a community to look to for
Yes,
help and for a sense of meaning. And a lot
yes,
of these protesters come to the protest for a sense of meaning that they get there, and because they don't have it anywhere else, and they don't have friends. I
yes,
think there was a poll that showed that a significant amount of young people in America do not have even one friend. And so when they go to these colleges, they're very lonely, and they find friends online, and they're invited to protests, and they're invited to. So it's a lot of it has to do with the breakup of the American community and just American civility. And it just seems to me that as a society in the West, we have, I think, we have to do something about. I'm not saying the governments have to do it, but as people,
yes,
make people more understand how important it is to go out of the computer, out of the house. I know it's
yes,
like a weird thing, but it will combat this in a very large way. I think people will be able to meet other people that think differently from them. They'll meet people for coffee. They'll go out. I mean, it's obvious 10 years ago, 20 years ago when I was a kid, we would go out to play ball. No one does it anymore. And
yes.
I think it has a lot of influence on a lot of the way young people think today. And it's very, very sad to see. Not even to do with Israel in a lot of ways. I
I
don't know. That's just
agree.
my thinking.
No, I agree 100%. And what's interesting is I think I've already seen some assessments about who are the young people, what majors they come from, the people who are
Yeah.
protesting. So, I don't think that there's a lot of engineering students, a lot of medical
Exactly.
students. Maybe there are, but the majority, there probably are, but the
Social
majority,
sciences.
social sciences, humanities, humanities have really become, unfortunately, I mean, you talk about people being angry. Well, sure, the kind of world, the vision of the world that they present is
Exactly.
just, it's really, that anybody would despair. So,
And
there's literally,
also, right. And also in these studies, we spoke about it just a little bit, that they're teaching them to hate America, let alone Israel. They're
yes,
teaching them how bad our society is. They never teach
yes,
about how bad third world, countries are where they're stoning gays. And, it's
yes,
very not progressive to stone gays. I'm sorry. I know we're very
100%.
transphobic here, but we're not stoning gays in the
Yes.
West. And it's like, I don't know.
I
It's
mean,
very
look,
depressing in a way, but there is, I think, a lot of hope in the sense that a lot of these people, I think, when they'll go out into the world, at least that's my hope, they'll see, maybe
yes.
they'll see how much they've been brainwashed. I know, but maybe they're not. I don't know.
Well, but I think that you're really getting onto something here that's very, very important. This is something that comes up in conversations with people that I had, where we've really miseducated people on the role of the United States in the
Yeah.
world. Certainly in the 20th century, it won the war for freedom. It really won. In the victory in the Cold War was a victory of liberty over tyranny. I mean, it's almost old-fashioned to be saying it, and I feel like I'm going to sound like such a old-fashioned, I don't know, conservative crank, which is not at all
But
how
it's
I think of
true.
myself. But like a good dose of American patriotism is really what's needed. And what's interesting is, I don't know if you saw this episode where a group of frat boys on an American campus held up and prevented kind of the
North
desecration.
Carolina, University of
Yes,
North Carolina.
prevented
Yeah.
the desecration of the American flag. wow, that created such an outburst of enthusiasm. You know, some people decided to raise some money for them, to throw a beer party for them, and they raised accidentally $500,000. You know,
Yeah.
because I mean, people, this is what people want to see. People appreciate it. People love this either displays, national displays
Yeah.
of patriotism. I think we need more of that.
Izabella Tabarovsky, thank you so much for being with us. I have to say that this subject is going to go on with us for the the future.
Yes,
It's not going away, and we'll
yes,
have you back on hopefully, because I
wonderful.
think it's important that even after the war, because when wars happen, you see the worst, things that are up under the surface come up, but it's under the surface way before. It's been here, like you
Yes.
said, for 50, 60 years already, and we can't, so thank you very much for being with us, and I really, really appreciate it. And thank you everyone else for listening, watching, and subscribing. And thank you so much.